Kia ora, John Fallett, Chief Executive here at Water New Zealand. In December last year, the report of the Havelcok North drinking water inquiry was tabled with the government. While the government is now thinking about its reaction, Water New Zealand has been undertaking a series of seminars around New Zealand to explain to the industry what the inquiry's report might mean should the government decide to act on it. The inquiry report is bold, it's comprehensive and it's evidence-based. It makes 51 recommendations for changes to the way in which the water sector should operate going forward. And during February and March of 2018, Noel Roberts, the Technical Manager at Water New Zealand, and Jim Graham, our Principal Water Quality Scientist, have been going around New Zealand talking to the industry about what's in the report. They talk about the risk factors that face the sector, they talk about the inquiry's recommendations, they talk about the sorts of changes that the inquiry is recommending that the government make. We recorded this presentation at Napier in February of 2018, where close to ground zero near Havelcok North, where the contamination event occurred. And so this presentation is about making sure that the industry is up to speed with what's going on and is prepared for the changes that are going to come.
So first of all, a quick recap on the event in stage one of the inquiry. So in the 5th and 6th of August there was a rain event, and the Science Caucus decided there's an 86% probability that the rain that washed sheep faeces into Mungus Stream Pond, which is that green looking pond you see in the bottom there. It's not normally that colour. That was part of the science for working out determining where it came from. That was that they dyed that one green, a very bright green, and then created the same effect as a flood event. And they discovered that within 26 hours the water in that pond turns up in one of the bores that supply Havelcok North. They also at the same time flooded another area around a borehead, and they dyed that one red, and within about 32 hours that ended up in the drinking water supply as well. There was no treatment at the time. It was the supplies for Havelcok North have a secure drinking water status, which I'll get into later what that actually means. It was quite a significant event. The towns were about 14,000 people. 5,500 people were sick, and that was determined mostly by a phone survey. 45 people were hospitalised, 3 possibly more people died, and there's also at least 2 people, I was talking to one last week, that still have not gone back to work since the event. So it has quite big health implications. Yeah, and you think it's a town of what, 14,000 people, and 5,500 people are sick, then how many others are also having a home care as well? So it has big implications as to the whole community. So they called for a government inquiry, and early on they decided that the inquiry should be broken up into 2 stages. So the first stage was done like a court hearing type process. They found that no individual was to be held responsible. 3 organisations certainly had an opportunity to prevent the contamination if they'd thought about things differently. So the regional council were there, they're the guardians of the source, so they had the environmental knowledge. There was knowledge that the Mungus Stream Pond did go up and down with aquifer levels. The Hastings District Council, with the way they were doing the managing the operations of the water supply, that had improvement opportunities in it. And the drinking water assessors, which are part of the District Health Board, we'll get into later how they work, they were having more of a hands-off approach. And so if any one of those 3 parties did things differently, then there was an opportunity that the contamination might have been avoided. How those 3 organisations work together, it was described as poor, and that's a systemic issue, which is where stage 2 comes into. So that's to do with how do we prevent a similar contamination occurring in New Zealand? What findings, what preventive options are there? That's what we're going to talk about today. The inquiry itself was quite well run. They were very well informed. They asked a lot of good targeted questions. Even prior to the stage 2 hearing beginning, they asked for 188 different issues on 24 different topics for submissions on those. Not all organisations submitted to all of them, but there was quite a few. See, that report came out on the 5th of December last year.
The report provides us with some really instructive quotes all the way through. And the first one I want to look at is this one here. Because what it says is central government is responsible for ensuring that the drinking water supplies in New Zealand are safe. Now that doesn't mean they have to deliver those water supplies, but it means they have the responsibility for passing legislation, for ensuring there's standards, and a whole bunch of other things that are necessary to make sure that water that people drink is safe. It's important. It's really important because of the environmental landscape in which water supplies exist, because that's an environment of risk. An inquiry has this first section called a general risk landscape that tells us about it. And the first thing it tells us that we need to know is that contamination of water supplies is sporadic. There's no pattern to it. It happens in a haphazard and sporadic manner. And it's very unpredictable. We don't know when contamination is going to occur. We don't know when there's going to be some kind of failure. We don't know when things are going to go wrong. And so that's a very instructive starting point for considering risks in water supply. What we do know is that things change. Things change within the environment that a water supply is in, and the conditions that might be your baseline conditions are not going to be the conditions that your supply will be operating under all of the time. And so we have these things we call event conditions: heavy rainfall, dry spells, a change of land use, etc., etc. The key thing is we don't know anywhere near as much as we thought we did about contamination of water supplies and contamination events. If we can take one thing from the inquiry, it's that. We thought we knew a lot more than we actually did know. And we can't foresee all of the circumstances under which contamination will occur. This is what the inquiry says. We can't foresee all of the circumstances under which contamination will occur. And so, if you look at the Havelcok North situation and groundwater supplies, suddenly we know a whole lot more about groundwater supplies than we did 18 months ago. Probably even more so from the events in the Hutt Valley in the last 18 months, where a water supply that was considered to be secure bore water, in other words, you take it out of the ground, you don't need to treat that water because it's so clean and pure, meets the criteria for secure bore water, has some low levels of E. coli in it. And Wellington Water investigates and they find out that actually there's low levels of E. coli, but there's relatively elevated levels of total coliforms. And that tells us that there's some microbiological contamination of that water supply. They investigate further, and Wellington Water's got to be commended for what they did. They investigate further, and they find that there's a whole lot of things about groundwater that they had thought was true, that is, in the Hutt Valley situation, not true. And so, for example, we tend to think of confining layers or aquatards or aquicludes in a water supply. You have a layer of gravel and then you have a layer that water can't pass through, and the idea is that the water below that is pure and pristine and can't be contaminated. And we used to think that in every situation those aquicludes were pretty much continuous. We now know that's not true. And what they found out in the Hutt Valley was that actually there's a bit over here and there's a bit here and a bit over here, and surface water can go into the shallow groundwater and can go into the deeper groundwater. We used to think, and I was at the Ministry of Health when we wrote the 2005 and particularly the 2008 standards, and we used to think about groundwater, this thing of residence time. We thought that water was underground for a long period of time. We thought if you took a test today and it said that water was 20 years old, if you took the same test tomorrow, you'd find it was still 20 years old next week, next month, next year, in 5 years' time, it would always be about the same age. And we know now that that's not true. We know that's not true from a whole lot of samples that have been taken. So groundwater is way more dynamic than we ever thought it would be. And it moves through the ground a whole lot faster than we thought. Way, way faster than what we thought it did in certain circumstances. So we've got many things working in a risk landscape that is considerably complex, and there's all these new things changing and happening as well: climate change, weather events, land use changes, that's making things more and more complex. And so, as I said before, water supplies exist in a dynamic and changing environment. One of the real benefits of water supply is that you can get water from the environment, you can treat it, and you can distribute it to your consumers in a very short time. 24 hours, 12 hours, sometimes 6 hours. And that's great for a consumer's point of view. But it's also a huge risk, because it means that if you have a problem, you get that problem to your consumer very fast. And the speed with which we supply water is a risk in itself. So if you put all that together and you say we've got this risk environment, we don't know anywhere near as much as we thought we know or thought we knew, and we've got things changing, there's one thing that's going to be your biggest enemy, and that is this thing called complacency. And if people get complacent around a water supply, we're headed for disaster. And the inquiry makes this point very, very clearly. And if you look at the studies of outbreaks across the globe, you find that complacency is the biggest common factor in just about every outbreak, some kind of complacency. And so, we've got a general risk landscape in which we've learned a lot about pathogens. We know a whole lot more about... In 1984, Cryptosporidium and Protozoa was not thought to be an organism that caused illness, and wouldn't, if it contaminated a water supply, it wouldn't be a problem. 1984, that's our thinking. We now know that that's not true. Our knowledge about pathogens has changed enormously. There's been a lot of science around Campylobacter, which animals have it, etc., etc. And particularly, we're getting a very new understanding of the importance of viruses to water supply contamination and water supply illness. And viruses are very significant. For example, viruses live a lot longer in groundwater than we ever thought was possible. This is new science, new information. We must take account of that information. So while we know more about the pathogens, and we're learning more about the pathways and contamination pathways and how these events occur, we still don't know anywhere near as much about those things as we thought we knew, think we know, or need to know. Put it all together, and you can only come to one conclusion about water supply, and that is, if we're going to run a water supply, we must have the highest standards of diligence and care. And the inquiry says, actually, if you look at other industries where an event or a mistake or an error can result in catastrophic problems in terms of people's health or death, you look at those industries and they say medicine or aviation, those industries have really strict rules, they have very high standards of care, a lot of diligence and a lot of oversight. Inquiry says actually water supply is exactly the same as those kind of things, because you've got the potential to make so many people sick so quickly. And we should have those same levels of oversight, of regulation, of diligence and of care.
Though it's called the Havelcok North Inquiry, the Stage 2 is definitely a national issue. It's the systemic issues that happen around the country. So what other events have occurred? The second largest event actually happened in 1984 in Queenstown. There is sewage overflow, flowed into the lake, the pristine lake. That was taken with no treatment barrier as well, and that got into the supply. There, about 3,500 people came down with gastro illness. Back in 1984, they couldn't tell you what the gastro illness was, but yeah, imagine that happened now with the tourist numbers that go through Queenstown and what effect that would have on all New Zealanders and as well as the tourism industry. Another recent event happened in Darfield in 2012, August. There, it was also a change occurred. It wasn't a wastewater overflow, it was the operators turned around and changed to a different bore source. Unbeknownst to them, the chlorine system that attached with that bore wasn't running, and so you ended up with a non-chlorinated supply going in, being drunk. There, 138 people came down with a gastro illness. So they do occur out there. The World Health Organization estimates that 2.1 million people die annually from waterborne diseases. About 65% of those can be prevented with some form of water treatment. And as Jim's going to talk to later on in this presentation, in New Zealand, There was one report that says between 18 and 34,000 New Zealanders a year get sick from gastro illness. There was discussion during the inquiry that that figure actually could be closer to 100,000. So we'll hear more about that later. So what are these pathogens that people talk about? A pathogen is a biological agent that can cause illness. There are hundreds of thousands of them. I've put up some slides because they're interesting looking pictures. They are the most common ones. Cryptosporidium and Giardia, the two on the left, they are known as protozoa. They're quite a hardy beast to remove. That they're also larger than anything else by quite a long way. Cryptosporidium in the round cyst state at the very top left corner is actually immune to, well, I wouldn't say immune, it laughs at chlorine basically for drinking water levels. It will not kill it at all. In Milwaukee, a while ago. 99, yeah. A city of 1.6 million people, 400,000 people became ill from Cryptosporidium. These pathogens can come from multiple sources, both animals and humans. Funny enough, humans don't like human waste. Yeah, we can put that. Giardia is perhaps a more common one in New Zealand, but it's a lot easier to remove. There's processes that remove Giardia, whereas Cryptosporidium is a bit harder. There's bacteria that Jim talked about as well, and viruses. So the two bacteria showing up there are Campylobacter jejuni. So that's what the pathogen that caused the Havelcok North outbreak, but they came from sheep as opposed to human or cattle. The other one that I've got down there is E. coli. That is an indicator organism. It's probably one of the more tested for common organisms out there. Humans and E. coli happily coincide. You'll end up with hundreds of thousands of those per person. And it's all to do with trying to track down where the fecal oral route is, whether it comes from animals or humans, but whether it's got into water. The test for E. coli typically takes 24 hours to process, so the best you can ever get at the moment, it will tell you that yesterday's water was okay. There is one variant of the E. coli that is actually toxic to New Zealanders, to humans and New Zealanders. Yep. The other two pictures up there are viruses, so they're a whole lot smaller again. Imagine these things getting smaller and smaller as I talk them through. Polio, just an interesting looking critter. But I like the one on the right there, it looks like coming out of War of the Worlds. That is actually infecting a bacteria, to give you an idea of the size of it. So it's about 1,000 times smaller than E. coli or Campylobacter. So they're the type of pathogens we're talking about and trying to get out of water supply. You cannot see them, they're there. So, Professor Steve Harudi and his wife Elizabeth wrote this book, and we actually got him to do some submissions for part of the inquiry for international comparisons. Steve and his wife, Steve was actually part of the Walkerton, for those in the water industry, there was an outbreak in Walkerton, he was involved with the technical advice for that. But the book's about, they studied 70 affluent nations across the world and looked at the common themes for the last 20 years for water outbreaks. And he came up with these 6 principles. Steve's principles are very close to the water inquiries ones. These are the principles here. This is like the 6 commandments of water treatment. Everything we do should take these into effect. The very first principle there is the one that differs a little bit from Steve Harudi's. Steve Harudi's just goes pathogens, pathogens, pathogens. Everything else is a bit more pale in comparison. Whereas the inquiry's gone, okay, standard of care must be embraced. So that's about the water supply must take standard of care to remove the pathogens from the supply. There are other risks as well. You've also got chemical risks as part of water supply. There's lots of risks, but for the main primary one that causes infections and outbreaks and contamination events is pathogens. The second principle is about prevention. So protect the water source. What you can remove from the source whenever it hits the treatment process has got to add value. The third one there is about multiple barriers. This is to do with treatment processes, which I'll get into later, and what barriers are there to try and protect the events getting through. A single process can fail. A single person can make a mistake. By having multiple barriers, you've then got a less chance of a contamination event flowing on through. Change precedes contamination. So for Havelcok North, it was a rain event. For Queenstown, hopefully it's nothing in Christchurch. For Queenstown, it was a sewage overflow. For Darfield, it was a change in operation conditions. Going by Steve Harudi's book and the likely sources of contamination across the world, across those 70 affluent nations, a third are about from contamination from animals, a third's about contamination from humans, that's going into the source of the treatment, and about a third are from contamination of supply or opening of cross connections, risk of backflows, those type of events. So there's a lot of risks in water supply there. So it's being aware of what changes have occurred and trying to be diligent. Suppliers must own the safety of the drinking water. So that's about not that the risk actually lives with the supplier. If you contract it out, the risk is still there. It's about owning the risk and managing it. The other part of that is also the applied preventative risk management approach. So for New Zealand, that's about water safety plans. And some suppliers treat that as a compliance activity, just go and tick box, job done, I've done what it said to do. Others getting into actually what are the risks, that really owning it, getting down to it and understanding what they're trying to prevent.
What the inquiry does is it says, ask the question, what are the problems, the systemic issues in the New Zealand drinking water industry? And we want to look at 5 of those. There was more, but these were the 5 main ones that we picked out. Burden of disease, disease burden, compliance, leadership, secure bore water, and resourcing. And so, if you look at the first one, burden of disease, back in 2007, a guy called Andrew Ball, who worked for ESA, he was a microbiologist, was doing his PhD, and he did a study to estimate the number of people that get sick from water supplies in New Zealand. Now, you can't count that number. So you can only estimate, and that's what we do. So Andrew Ball reckons, somewhere between 18,000, 34,000. This other group, back in 2010, says actually it's probably 35,000. There's a whole bunch of other people say, well, it's probably up around 100,000. And I don't know what that figure is. But I know that even if it's 18,000, that's a lot of sick people. That is preventable illness. And that's a lot of people who should not be getting ill, because a water supply should not make you ill. And this is what the inquiry says. So disease burden, the inquiry says, is a problem, and it's a problem that we should not have. The other thing that the inquiry says is we've got a huge problem with compliance. And so they look at the statistics here. So here we're talking about large water supplies, and what this graph tells us is that if you look at large water supplies, so we're talking about places like Auckland and Wellington, but also places like Taupo, Napier, Timaru, serving more than 10,000 people. If you look at those supplies and the people who live in those communities, you find that only about, in 2016-17, only about 88% of those people are drinking water that complies with the drinking water standards. So that tells us that about 12% are drinking water that does not comply. The next slide looks at smaller supplies, and okay, there's been some improvement, but here, look at this. Somewhere around 28% of people in these communities are drinking water that does not comply with drinking water standards. And if you look at smaller supplies still, 50% of people in these smaller supplies, and we're talking about places as big as Kaikoui, Wairoa, Glenorchy, Arrowtown. Only half the people who live in communities this big are drinking water that complies with drinking water standards. Well, you think it couldn't get any worse, but if you look at smaller supplies, it is. Nearly 70% of people in tiny little places as big as Ekatahuna or Devotional, if you know where that is, 70% are drinking water that doesn't comply with drinking water standards. And the inquiry says, this is an alarming statistic. It's hard not to agree. It's hard not to agree. But the thing that's really, really interesting is this one. If you put them all together, and the light blue line there is all supplies, you get an overall picture of how many people are drinking water that complies with drinking water standards. The most important line on this graph is the black line, because that's the trend line of whether or not we're getting an improvement. And yeah, okay, you could say, yes, we've gone from, over the last 10 years, we've got about a 5% improvement, which means that at that rate of improvement, we'll get to our target. And what should our target be? Well, I think it's 100%. The inquiry thinks it's 100%. We'll get there in quite a long time. So the inquiry looks at this and this says, and they say, this is not good enough. for an affluent, modern nation like New Zealand to have compliance with drinking water standards at levels that is this low. So what they say is have a look at other countries. Where are other countries? Well, and you can argue that it's not exactly comparable and different types of supply, etc., but the simple fact of the matter is if you go to England or Scotland, similar supplies have compliance rates of over 99%. And the inquiry says, well, if they can have compliance rates like that, why can't we? Why are our compliance rates so low? And the conclusion they come to, and the conclusion that they draw, is that if we're going to get to those levels of compliance around our drinking water standards, we will need stronger, more aggressive enforcement approach. A stronger, more aggressive enforcement approach. They say the problem in terms of compliance is that no one's being made to comply. Water suppliers are choosing not to comply with the drinking water standards. The other little thing here that's interesting is this, coming from the inquiry. It's a little bit of an aside, but it's boil water notices. Boil water. So back in 2004, the Minister of Health at the time made a statement that said, New Zealanders, regardless of where they live, have a right to a safe drinking water supply. And that's been the idea that's been prominent in New Zealand since that time. And it's a simple idea. But if you've got a water supply and you issue a boil water notice, what are you saying? As a water supplier, you're saying, we will provide you with water that is not safe to drink, and it's your responsibility to make it safe to drink. Now, that's not a responsible position from a water supplier. Water suppliers have a responsibility to provide water that is safe to drink. And if it's a temporary boil water notice, that just means that you're saying that some of the time, don't drink this water. The inquiry looks at this and says, why have we got boil water notices? What are our water suppliers doing if they're issuing boil water notices, and what are they not doing that means they have to issue permanent boil water notice? What is that? So the inquiry was pretty critical of this situation. So what do you do about this? The inquiry looked at what is the problem around compliance and what should you do. And what they find is that there's this thing called the softly, softly approach. And the inquiry is very critical of this. So the softly, softly approach is an approach that says we have legislation, we have drinking water standards, water suppliers are required to comply with the drinking water standards under the legislation, but if they don't, we'll encourage them to. We'll cajole them, we'll give some advice, some assistance. But we won't prosecute or take an enforcement order or do anything more than that. We'll just encourage them. So the softly, softly approach is a problem. Cajoling, cooperating, and it makes DWAs, drinking water assessors, who are the regulatory people, uncertain of where they stand about the Ministry's enforcement policy. Drinking water assessors are not sure what that policy is. They're not getting any clear direction from the Ministry. There's a lack of guidelines on policy. So no one knows where they stand. And if you've got that situation of confusion, you're going to have very poor rates of compliance. Because water suppliers know that if they don't comply, there will be no consequence. The other thing that the inquiry identifies is here a thing called all practical steps. And so the legislation says our drinking water supplier will take all practicable steps to comply with the drinking water standards. And that means you don't have to comply with the drinking water standards. You have to try really hard to. And the inquiry concluded that that's a barrier to compliance because it gives water suppliers an out. And even gives them a defence. So if there was a prosecution, they could have mounted defence and said, well, we're taking all practicable steps. We were trying to comply, we didn't, but we were taking all practical steps, and the legislation allows that. So the inquiry is very critical of that because it says it makes compliance for a water supplier discretionary. The other thing that the inquiry covered a lot about the industry was this question of leadership. And they received submissions that there's a vacuum of leadership in the drinking water industry. And so many of you who will have been around back in the 2000s, from probably the 1990s actually, and when I was at the Ministry of Health 2005, 2008, will remember Dr. Michael Taylor. He was highly respected by the World Health Organization. He was often being asked to go to international conferences and speak and do things on an international stage, nowhere near as appreciated as that much in New Zealand. But he provided leadership to the New Zealand industry. He organised our drinking water standards, he pushed the legislation through Parliament, he did a whole bunch of these kind of things, and he provided that leadership. He retired in 2008, and there was no replacement for him. And that vacuum of leadership became apparent. So in 2007, 2008, and I went to overseas conferences with Michael, and New Zealand was considered by many overseas countries to be a world leader in risk management and drinking water standards. We were held up there by a whole bunch of other countries as a world leader because of Michael Taylor. Since he's gone, what the inquiry found is we've fallen well behind in international best practice. The inquiry says that leadership is more than just performing your statutory duties. There's a whole bunch of other things. And it says if we're going to address the systemic issues that the inquiry has found, we'll need really good leadership. Now I was going to tell you about another of the issues that has arisen with the inquiry.
So the secure bore water status was quite relevant to this case because it was Havelcok North as a purely groundwater supply. There was 14 of the 51 recommendations for stage 2 of the report, 4 alone were just on the secure bore water status. So how big is the issue? How many people are actually using the secure bore water status? So these come from the draft ESR report from the Ministry of Health. This is something that the Ministry of Health is required to do under the Health Act. ESR do this on their behalf. So these are the draft figures that for the report that yet to be released for this year. So it's on 3.8 million people. So these are the people on the network supplies. It's not the private use, which Jim will talk about later. The date at the bottom there is 2007, which is quite apt for what we're talking about next, and the changes in thinking. So it's to do with this confining layer, is the idea of this secure bore water status. So in the ideal world, that grey line there would be like a very thick clay layer, impervious to water. If it's impervious, it's called an aquiclude. If it lets some water go through, it's called an aquitard, which would be like a silt or a loamy sands. And the blue areas would be typically gravels. And so above that line would be known as just a typical groundwater. Below the confining layer, it then becomes a confined aquifer. And modelling, they can make all this work, and even 2007 they had it work for modelling, that if you put water goes in here and you abstract at this rate, then this is how it all balances out. And back then the thinking was that you get about 1/2 to 2 metres a day would flow through the aquifer if you talk to some of the hydrologists. In reality, it's really hard to tell what happens underground, because all people have to look at is this sort of information. So this happens to be Brookvale Road in the Hiratonga Plains. So the numbers at the bottom there is where Brookvale Road's along that line there. Looking from the top, you can see what land activities they're on, but it's easy to look at for your right from anyone just driving past. The black lines are to do with bore logs, and these are actually available on the Hawke's Bay Regional Council website. That's quite common for most regional councils to have bore logs. And from that, they can turn around and work out where, depending on the driller, what the confining layers are, and going by their description as the mud and stuff comes out. If lucky, they might have taken a core sample. Some of those bores will be drinking water. Some of them will be irrigation bores. Some will be stated environment monitoring bores, which is an activity that regional councils do. And there'll be bores there that there is no record of that even exists. In the case of Havelcok North, they discovered about 148 bores, I think it was, within a 500 metre radius that weren't even on the register. There is new technology out there that didn't exist in 2007. And the thinking was that it used to be that nice, homogeneous, continuous layer. But we know Mother Nature, it never works that way. This is the same area. So the blue areas there are the confining layers from the bore logs. The actual bit, this line here, this along Brookvale Road still, is actually a new technology where the guy goes through and it took about half an hour to go down the road and work out what was happening down to 140 metres depth, where the confining layers are, but how interconnected they were. So the skewable water status relies on three main criteria, really. The first one is that the bores are 30 metres deep. The theory being there'd be no groundwater source and that the connection to the zone wouldn't happen, and assuming there's a confining layer in between. I'm aware of in South Australia, they've got bores that are over 100 metres deep and they're still finding E. coli in those. Another criteria they have is that the bores are 12 months, the water, age date water, that it's 12 months old. And that's to do with the viruses are quite hardy beasts. And because they're quite small, they'll travel a long way in an aquifer. They're quite fine. And some of those will survive up to around 200 days. So if it's 1 year old, in theory, those particles, those pathogens have died off. There's a problem with the age dating criteria was that it was only had, for the drinking water standards, only had been carried out every 5 years. And those were typically done in nice stable environments, not during a rain event. There's no seasonal pattern picked up from that. The other criteria they had, the third criteria for the skewable water status, is that there's no E. coli test present in the testing. But the ironic thing is, as part of the, if you had skewable water status, is that you could test less. You didn't have to test as much for the risk that might have been present. Some of the other changes that have gone on and recent discoveries, some of them very close to here, is that the water in aquifers actually travel a whole lot faster in some cases. You can have hidden rivers under the confining layers. It was discovered that one aquifer, the water travels 200 metres a day, not 0.5 to 2, but 200. So where does your protection zone go for pathogens that can turn up there? Yeah. And so because of that high transport rate, for the pathogens can come a whole lot further away. Yeah. You've also got humans living above, and cattle for that matter as well. Where's the effluent being spread? And now you can see that there is actually pathways where water can, from the surface, get down into where the bores are. Not all bores across the country are like this, but how do we know? Yeah. Another unique, well not necessarily unique, but New Zealand risk is what happens in an earthquake. Can we assume that those confining layers are still intact? In Adelaide, recently they have solvents have got into the aquifer from an industrial area above. So they've now had to turn those bores off until that's flush cleaned. Yep. We've got nitrates in water, in groundwater coming up. So that's semi-indicating that there's a path from surface from animals getting into the water. We have the uncapped unknown bores. What are the state of those? Where are they? How are they decommissioned? You've got screw piles that are going in for construction of, for foundation of buildings. Aquifers can be as shallow as 11 metres deep. There's quite a few that I know of that are only that deep. Screw piles can go well past that. So there's another pathway that's actually man's creating. Yeah. These are, well, you've also got the state of the bores themselves. It's hard to check the bore casings. Have they corroded it deep underground? There's not a lot of technology at that stage that's going to help a water supplier out to determine the state of their assets in that space. These are only some of many risks out there for groundwater sources, and it's why skewable water status was such an issue in the inquiry and why they made quite a few recommendations.
And what the inquiry found was there's a real problem with resourcing in the industry. And so they start with drinking water assessors. And there's a lot of criticism of the performance of the drinking water assessors at Havelcok North. And my view of this is yeah, that criticism is valid, but you must understand the reasons for it. There's a number of them. And the first one is a drinking water assessor has two masters. They are accountable to the Director of General Health at the Ministry of Health, but they're employed by a District Health Board. So as soon as you've got two people trying to be the managers or the people who decide what a group of others do, you've got a problem. The inquiry also said there's a real problem with the leadership of DWAs, and they said that the issues that were identified at Havelcok North of drinking water assessors are across the whole country. That's not an issue that's confined with the drinking water assessors to just Havelcok North. My view is that you can't blame the individual drinking water assessors at all, because the problem is the structure, and this is what the inquiry says about that particular thing. So it says, first up, drinking water assessor training is inadequate. They're not trained to the level that they need to be. They don't have the technical skills that they need. As well as that, the inquiry was very concerned to know that currently there's no training available for drinking water assessors in New Zealand. And that's an environment where they need improved technical knowledge, further training, higher levels of technical knowledge. And there's a shortage as well. The inquiry said to a senior drinking water assessor in New Zealand, tell us how many drinking water assessors would you need? And he said, well, we need 45 FTE. So that's 30% more than there currently is. But the current drinking water assessor workforce only works part-time. They're not full-time FTEs. They work on Smoke-Free Environments Act, that's trying to stop dairies selling cigarettes to minors. They work on communicable disease work, they do border control work, chasing mosquitoes. They've got a whole range of jobs they do. Drinking water is only a part of it, and so they are only part-time. So drinking water assessors are critical, the inquiry says, to safe water supplies. We aren't going to have safe water supplies without well-qualified, well-resourced and competent drinking water assessors. And they say the current setup simply doesn't work. Of the drinking water assessors, they say, the inquiry, there's not enough, they're underfunded, they have a lack of scientific and technical support. It's a recipe that'll never ever work. But they say it's not just the drinking water assessors. It's not just the drinking water assessors. What they say is that there's a problem with resourcing in our water suppliers as well. There's a simple problem, and local authorities don't have the rating base required to fund an increasingly technical and complex utility. And it's like this, and many of you will know, back in the 50s and 60s, water supply was simple, totally simple. You found the cleanest water you could find and you added chlorine. So it's changed. It's changed completely. Drinking water supply has changed completely. It's highly technical, it's highly complex. If you're doing chlorine analysis, you need an online chlorine monitor. You've got to have that calibrated regularly. You've got to telemeter the data to an alarm on an operator's pager or phone, and so that they can respond when the chlorine level gets too low, and all goes, the data goes to the local authority. You've got to manage your trends and all that kind of stuff. It's changed completely. It's very complex. And local authorities, with a very small rating base, find it very difficult to fund that level of complexity and technical requirement. The inquiry says, though, it's not LA's fault. It's the limitation of the structure that has small entities delivering costly services. So they say there's a structural problem that is behind the resourcing issue. So those are the problems, and if you look at it, we've got a risk landscape, and we've got a bunch of serious problems. We've talked about 5 of them. You can only come to one conclusion, and that is we need to change the way that we do things. And that's the conclusion that the inquiries come to. And so what they do is they say we'll make some recommendations, and the recommendations they make are split up into those that are early and urgent and those that are further recommendations. We want to talk about these early and urgent recommendations because the inquiry says you got all these things, you got this risk landscape, you got these problems and blah 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 blah. What are you going to do? And that was the job of the inquiry. Tell us what we should do. Tell the government what it should do. And so it says do a bunch of things first here, and it gives us 19 recommendations that are early and urgent. And the first one is very significant, and it's this: change the regulatory model. Change the regulatory model and have a new enforcement regime. A new enforcement regime that has one single regulator across all of New Zealand, exactly what they have in the UK, where they have the Drinking Water Inspectorate. So take the Ministry of Health and 10 DHBs out of this picture and have one dedicated national regulator. And that regulator has a graduated series of enforcement measures. The idea here is that the regulator needs a bunch of things that they say, you're not complying, I'm going to do this. If you don't sort it out, I'm going to do this. And then they do this and this. And at the end of that list, they drag the sorry backside of the water supply into court and prosecute them. So that's what the inquiry is saying. And they're talking about an enforcement policy with teeth. And the reason being, and this is a very significant point that the inquiry makes, this is a very important quote, to change the mindset of drinking water suppliers. In other words, currently drinking water suppliers go, well, we don't comply with the drinking water standards, but what's going to happen if we don't? We're going to get noted in the annual review that we don't comply with the drinking water standards. There's no penalty, there's no problem, you don't get into any kind of trouble. That mindset has to change. The inquiry says that mindset has to change. Water suppliers need to understand that compliance is required for every drinking water supply. Full stop. And they say that if they do this, a dedicated regulator will resolve the issues around drinking water assessors. In other words, you've got a single organisation, all these problems with resourcing, with training, etc., with drinking water assessors get resolved because you've got a drinking water authority that has a single purpose, and those drinking water assessors have a single purpose, only one job, only one thing they do, and that's around drinking water supplies. And use these words, so recommends. In other words, they are saying this is what needs to occur. And so the idea is a simple one. If you're complying with the drinking water standards, there's no problem for you. The problem is we've got 67 drinking water suppliers in New Zealand, local authority suppliers, and I would be guessing that probably 60 of those have a water supply, at least one water supply that doesn't comply with drinking water standards. So that mindset change is going to apply to just about every water supplier in the country. But the inquiry says this is a good change. This is a beneficial change for water suppliers also, because it says to water suppliers, these are the standards, you must meet them, there's no ambiguity about where you stand or where we stand, it's very clear, let's get on and do it. So the recommendation is to establish a drinking water regulator, a national regulator, a dedicated regulator, and they will oversee all other reforms. In other words, you do this first, and everything else follows along behind. That's the idea. You get this set up first, you get it well resourced, you get it going, and everything else follows. And they need to be independent, they need to be well resourced, they need to have the proper expertise, and they need to cover all disciplines. And this is where your point comes in about the engineering. So they need to have, within that organisation, drinking water treatment, drinking water supply, engineering expertise. It's currently not there. They need to have a microbiologist, a water microbiologist. All sorts of different expertise will need to be in that organisation. And regulation, compliance, is going to be their primary focus. The inquiry says this is the best way forward, and it will drive change, it'll reduce risks, it'll reduce fragmentation within the industry, and it'll address many of the problems. And most importantly, it'll provide leadership, a crucial element of leadership. That leadership which the inquiry said was missing, has been missing for 10 years. Fill this leadership vacuum. And one of the experts at the inquiry said, actually, if you go to Australia, what you find is water suppliers really like the leadership that a good regulator provides, because they know where they stand. If they've got a problem, they can go and ask for assistance. And so the regulator isn't just a policeman with a big stick. Well, the inquiry said it has a much bigger role than that. It has an outcome that it wants to achieve of compliance, but it does a whole lot of other things, including bringing people from overseas to talk about new ideas, new technologies, making that kind of thing available. A whole bunch of things that it can do. So, probably one of the most significant, I think the most significant quote coming from this inquiry with regard to this question of regulation is this one here. A new regulator allows us to turn the page and make a new start. And I think this is one of the most important things that the inquiry says in terms of this question of regulation. Let's turn the page and do it differently.
Yeah, so we're still the urgent early ones. So these are still the actions where the inquiry is recommending that things happen very quickly. They recommend that the Director General of Health encourages and persuades suppliers to stop using the secure water status now. So although it was listed for the Director General to do it as early, because there's potentially cost implications for this, my gut feeling is it might take a bit longer than that. It might end up being in the recommended status, which is a bit further down the track. But they're still encouraging it to happen now. The 69U is getting into the Health Act, so is the 69W. 69U is to do with the protection of source of water. 69W is to take reasonable steps to supply wholesome water. So that water suppliers are obliged to provide safe water. Gens will take leadership in trying to encourage all this to happen. There's another recommendation in there. And when they're talking about effective treatment, that's not necessarily the same as chlorine. I'll elaborate on that a bit further. They're still getting quite adamant about that the Director General should go and do something. And he did. So this is the letter that came out on the 5th of December that went out to all water suppliers. The bottom two statements there read, to provide adequate protection of public health, all suppliers providing drinking water to untreated network suppliers should consider implementing appropriate and effective treatment without delay, and they should reconsider their reliance on secure water status as a means of providing safe drinking water. So this has come out from the Ministry of Health back in December. So what are those treatment processes that we're talking about? In the ideal world, this is where you go to your competent consultant and they talk about these things. I'm only just going to flash over as a bit of a high-level description. So UV or ultraviolet light, that's quite a common treatment. It doesn't actually remove pathogens, it deactivates them. The picture on the blue right there is actually a UV array. Yep. The next one down, filters and membranes are getting into your physical removal. The coagulation process is where if you have surface water and you have tannins and runoff from catchments and forestry blocks or farmland or whatever, those organics need to be removed from the process as well further down the track. There's also, because it's come from those environments, you'll have protozoa and things in there as well. Most common treatment plant in New Zealand would be coagulation with sand filters. They'll go down to remove about 1 micron. So a well-running plant there will remove your protozoa, your Giardia cryptos. It won't remove bacteria or viruses. If you want to get into that as a physical removal process, you're then getting into membranes. And these are getting more further down we get, the more complex some of these processes are getting. There's about 4 different flavours of membrane. They're all getting smaller and smaller particle sizes as you go down. Reverse osmosis and even nanofiltration is starting to get into the desalination, removing ions from water. It's that sort of small. They are really expensive to run, but it depends on the risk you've got there to manage. And often these processes we use in combination. You'll have a number of them to turn around and cover all your barriers. Your chlorination is a form of treatment, but really as your barriers protection, it's your last one, it's the bottom of the cliff. It does provide extra benefit in that it's the only process there that has ongoing benefits further into the system. Whereas if you dose chlorine, it's gone right through the system, it'll protect your network if there's leaks in your network, if something's got into a reservoir, contaminated that, it gives you some protection against that. But it is the very last barrier of protection. Yeah. Chlorine dioxide is a different chlorine. It's not as common. It comes with certain risks. All these have certain risks and pros and cons, which I'm not going to go into. Ozone is a different form of disinfection. That's the bottom picture there. That's an ozone generator. It has the same effects as chlorine, but there's no residual. There's one barrier. Once it's gone through that, there's nothing to protect the network afterwards. The middle picture there is of a membrane array. Toxins or cyanotoxins is another risk that water supplies have, and with climate change that's probably a growing one. They come from your algae, and as the temperature rises, especially on surface waters, if you get more algae in rivers, then the risk of toxins become higher, and some of the treatment for those gets quite complex as well. So these are all barriers of protection that are out there. Another recommendation is to do around the National Environment Standard. So this is getting into your first barrier of protection, if you like. This is the prevention of the source. National Environment Standard for sources of human drinking water was actually released in 2009. The Ministry of the Environment are already doing reviews, that they accelerate that, go a bit further. And they also recommend that 2 clauses in the RMA also get changed to reference the importance of human drinking water. That priorities get more balanced. Another recommendation they have, which is the formation of joint working groups. So part of just after the stage 1 of the inquiry ordered, if you like, the Hawke's Bay Regional Council, the Hastings District Council and the drinking water assessors to get together and start talking about the risks that are present in the water supply, both in the source and what's happening in the water supply itself. Are the right treatment process barriers are in place? Are they managing all the risks? This has the potential to go a whole lot further, because part of that whole water cycle is also your stormwater and wastewater, what's upstream. Having those three parties together brings all the knowledge in one place, because you've got the regional council that have all the environmental scientists understanding what's going on in the region. You have the drinking water assessors understanding what's the public health risks that are there present at the moment and how they're managed. And then you've got the drinking water operator, which is supplying the engineering experience, the risks that are currently managed and how their system is running. So together they can help manage those risks. It's actually recommended that formation of joint working groups is mandated. That's further down in the further recommendations, which we'll get to later. So it's something that needs to be working on. Some of the things they can look at is the bores in the region. The regional councils have quite a challenge. Some of the bores that are out there predate any database, so how do you even know where they are? So is there an inspection regime for those? That's both irrigation and state of environment bores. The protection zone around bores, your land management activities. If you look at what's going on in the UK at the moment, they're getting into pesticide management with farmers for those zones where there's groundwater use below. So it's quite a challenge, but these are things that have been looked at. And you've got effluent spreading, both from cow sheds and from human waste. You've got on-site wastewater systems that discharge that. There are contamination events globally where an on-site wastewater system or a septic tank has caused a contamination. A lot of those are done as a permitted activity, but yet there are risks to a water supply. When it comes to forming these joint working groups, I wouldn't recommend it's just tied down to those three parties. There are other expertise out there as well that also be tapped into. Iwi are very good at retention of intellectual knowledge, which was something that also came up in the inquiry of past events that have gone on and remembering what's happened there. They're also concerned about the environment, obviously. Hydrologists, bore drillers. Bore drillers don't have the high staff turnover that some of the larger entities do, and the retention of knowledge, and they also understand what's going on, what they're taking in the ground. Other early and urgent recommendations are to do around the Ministry of Health. These are the things that the Ministry of Health can do straight away. So of the 51 recommendations, 14 were for the Ministry of Health to do now, so quite a high percentage. There was 2 whole chapters devoted to the Ministry of Health of what they could do now. The main one, as Jim alluded to before, was to use the teeth they have now. Even the current drinking water standards, even though we, as an industry, think there are gaps in it and improvements that can be made, if that's applied and the softly approach isn't used, then that itself will make a difference. No one in New Zealand has been prosecuted for a water contamination event or a water supply issue or a non-compliance. Yet for the RMA or health and safety, a lot have. So it's giving the wrong message. What sort of teeth do they have? The current Health Act allows for a fine of up to $200,000 for any single event. And if it's continuing, then you can fine another $10,000 per day until the event's rectified. If there's a capital expenditure required to rectify that, then the dollars are going to start to mount up. There's another recommendation there about as Jim alluded to, with the 2 bosses for drinking water assessors, that get rectified. 69 ZZB and ZZC is probably not familiar to you. These are to do with that annual report that the ESR do for the Ministry of Health for compliance. For those that have read the report that comes out annually, it's not a user-friendly document. There's about 496 zones across the country. People are trying to work out where their town supply is and how that's performing. There's a few recommendations to turn that into a more user-friendly document. Something that's more traffic light based, something that the Joe Blogs, the normal ratepayers can understand the state of their supply. There is talk of that being used possibly as a name and shame to try and cajole water suppliers into being more, into inform them what's going on. So it's got a few recommendations for expert working groups. That actually was formed, the Ministry of Health formed an expert working group prior to the Stage 2 report coming out. Initially they were going to look at reviews to the drinking water standard. That has now changed to what can be implemented in the interim improvements. So like the drinking water assessors, doing multitask and doing part-time roles, so does the Ministry of Health. So the Ministry of Health need to boost their numbers so they can do what they need to do now, is one of the recommendations. The presence-absence test, that's, you know, the E. coli earlier on, one of those pathogens. There's one of the test methods from that is exactly that. After 24 hours going, have you got it there, have you not? And what a supplier needs to know then is going, okay, how big a risk is it? Is there a lot of them, or is it just one? And that gives an idea of sort of response that occurs. They're recommending that actually the presence-absent test is removed, because all that's really doing is delaying any speed of response by 24 hours. Just go with the enumerated result initially and use that as for compliance. They also talk about using the total coliforms, so the same test that has for E. coli. There's also coliforms there for total coliforms. It's just a case of counting them. That gives an idea of what's going on in the background of the environment. So the recommendation that they are both adopted. This is the only place in the Stage 2 report, in the early urgent and early section, that has a date. So it gives an idea of what the inquiry was thinking when they were thinking urgent and early. Water safety plans in the past, for some suppliers, have been treating as a tick box activity, whereas it's all about owning the risk and getting those there. What's important here is the critical control points of what they actually are. So you talked about those barriers, the treatment processes there before. Some of those are critical control points that if they fail, suddenly there's a big risk to supply. So this is an example of a critical control point. This is one for coagulation and sand filtration. What New Zealand are doing in this space is we're actually providing some training material. It should be up on our website in the next couple of weeks for a water supplier and drinking water assessor to how to determine what a critical control point is and what their risks are and how they manage it. So let's watch the space for this one.
Thanks, Noel. So urgent and early, the last urgent and early recommendation is a pretty simple one. Amend the Health Act urgently to change those two sections that say you've got to consult for a period of time and then you've got a buffer period before the standards can be introduced. So those are the early and urgent recommendations. The next section is called further recommendations that the inquiry has made. And there's 32 recommendations here. These are things that are going to be a bit harder to do. Legislative change, etc., etc. So we'll have a quick look at these and then we'll be nearly finished. We'll go through a few questions and a few other things. So the first one of these recommendations is this idea here of mandatory treatment. In other words, every drinking water supply in New Zealand has to have a treatment system, including residual chlorine. So this is a big recommendation. This is a big recommendation. The thing about it is that if you accept the risk landscape that I talked about, and if you accept particularly that the concept of secure bore water is flawed, and that's what the inquiry concluded, and therefore you accept that providing water without any level of treatment cannot be supported, you're left with only one conclusion, and that is every water supply must be treated. And that's what the inquiry has come up with. They say every water supply should be treated and should include a residual disinfectant, no exceptions, except for one exception, and that is provision should be made for water supplies without chlorine in very limited circumstances. The way the standards are currently written, they say that if you're going to use secure bore water criteria, there's a bunch of things, 3 or 4 things there that Noel talked about, and if you meet them, then you have secure bore water. Now remember, the Havelcok North, Brookvale Road bores met those criteria. And that was not a water supply that was safe to drink without treatment. The problem, or one of the problems, and a fundamental problem, was with the drinking water standards. It was with that secure bore water criteria in the standards. And so the onus of determining what circumstances you could have for where you'd use water without treatment straight from the ground rested with the drinking water standards and hence the Ministry of Health. So what the inquiry says, actually we shift the onus onto the water supplier. And if the water supplier wants to have water without treatment, the water supplier has to put together all the information they've got, all the information, and they have to make a case themselves for having a water supply without treatment. And then the new regulator puts together an expert group, and that expert group looks at that information and makes a decision. The idea is this: yes, you can have a water supply if you can convince us that you can do it with a minimal amount of risk, water supply without treatment, and the bar's way up here, and the costs are way up here. Or you can add chlorine, where the costs are way down here. And I suspect that's how things will pan out. And if I was going to have any involvement around this question, that's the way that I would approach it. So the inquiry says yes, in certain circumstances there might be exceptions, but the debate is, in those situations, not whether or not we have chlorine in those supplies, and it'll be very few supplies, but under what circumstances would we allow that to occur, and what would the water supply have to demonstrate for them to be allowed to do that. So mandatory treatment, why? Well, we've never had a problem before. We know that that does not mean you will never have a problem in the future. That's very, very evident. Things change, and there's a whole lot we still don't know. And as well, we've got ageing infrastructure, we've got deferred maintenance, we've got water supplies, some of which are in frankly very poor condition, underfunded for years and years. And here's the thing: you might be doing a whole bunch of E. coli testing. E. coli is not a risk management tool. E. coli is a verification tool that tells us that our water supply system, our water treatment system, was working 2 days ago. So forget about E. coli in terms of a safe water supply. E. coli tells you what was happening, or you didn't have a contamination, or you did 2 days ago. And the inquiry says actually E. coli testing never prevented an outbreak, and I think what they mean by that is that if you look at every outbreak across the globe, you'll find negative E. coli tests before the outbreak occurs. So there's a real question mark about E. coli. And if you look at untreated drinking water supplies in New Zealand in the last year, there's been 6 occurrences of positive E. coli tests, positive E. coli results. So you can't tell me that given all of the evidence that we've seen and the inquiry has seen, that there isn't a case for treatment of every drinking water supply. The evidence simply stacks up in one place, and the inquiry makes, I think, the only call that they can make, and that is treatment is necessary on every water supply. Because the inquiry says, and this is very clear, the concept of secure bore water, in other words taking water out of the ground and supplying it to consumers without treatment, is unsafe and unsound. So that's unequivocal, and that's one of these defining statements that I think that the inquiry has made. And so you end up with only one conclusion, and that is that universal treatment is necessary. And that is why the inquiry recommends such.
Another topic that's for further recommendations is licensing. Now, when most people see licensing, they're thinking driver's license, it's an individual person thing. What they were talking about here was licensing water suppliers. So at the moment we have the registration process, which isn't the same as licensing. For the registration process, it's more about where is the supply, does it need to be checked for compliance? And that's the basic idea behind the registration process. There is talk of actually changing that for this coming year, and that it includes what operators, what qualifications your staff have and what qualifications your contractors have. That's what's being talked about for the current version for this year. Licensing is a different ballpark again. Here they're talking about airline expositions, the similarity with the air industry. The airline expositions get into the security of long-term funding of an airline. Can they afford to operate? Can they afford to maintain long-term? They're talking applying this to a water supplier. So that has quite large implications. We look at some of the expensive processes and investment required for training and even just operations cost, let alone the capex cost. Can that be supported long-term? Another topic that was talked about, still part of licensing, was the competence of those governing the organisations. Do they have the right information? Are they making the right calls? That's not only for the top governance layers, it also goes down into the senior managers and the operations staff going through a water supplier. Have they got the public's best interest at heart when they're making the decisions? That also goes for contractors and consultants that are advising those water suppliers. Another topic that was talked about was a backup resource in case of failure. So that's whether, for any reason, whether a water supplier is no longer able to operate that water supply, who steps in to run it for them? The Australian example was mentioned here, and what happens in some cases, if there's similar processes go on, then a neighbouring water supplier would step into that role and there'd be agreement between the two suppliers, the two networks. In some cases, it's a larger entity within the region, or in some cases, also, if it's a large supply, they'll actually contract that out to, or like an insurance policy with some multi-internationals like Veolia or Suez involved. So that's a different concept for some water suppliers to get their head around if those recommendations are accepted. Other questions that come part of licensing and for the airline exposition is the state of the assets and the infrastructure, what maintenance practices are used, what adequate insurance they have, the qualifications and competency of senior staff, also what forward planning, contingency planning, and goes on, as well as the ability to train, maintain the workforce and replace staff. So these things that might be included in a licensing system that goes ahead. So big implications there. Qualifications is another one. There was a paper put together by Watercare, as well as then as an amendment to that, or a next version up done by Water New Zealand to do with the competency and training of staff. At the moment, it's voluntary, and the inquiry recommends that it's actually mandated. So there's certificate and diploma levels for treatment operators. The white paper that went up also goes, the knowledge also needs to be in the team leaders and those managing directly supplying those suppliers as well. But they also need ongoing continued professional development and also an experience level in those roles as well. At the moment, that process is actually parked because we're relying on funding from Ministry of Health, and with the report that's come out, that's looking for new sources of funding for that at the moment. Might go to industry yet, don't know. But there will certainly be a consultancy process with that. It's not dead, that one. It's still moving forward. Jim.
It goes without saying that there's a recommendation on changing the Health Act. And if the government's going to do a bunch of the other recommendations, they'll have to change the legislation to do that. So changes to the Health Act are a given. But actually what the inquiry says is, let's have our own Drinking Water Act. And the reason is, very simply, that it highlights the importance of drinking water and it helps the regulator, because the regulator's not then using part of an act that everyone else is using other bits of. They've got their own act, and everything that they are doing is under that one act. So that's a bit of a no-brainer. Other changes to the Health Act, or to be to the new Drinking Water Act, is get rid of all practical steps. So all of the duties that water suppliers have, they have to do them full stop. But also they suggest that shift all of the powers to the drinking water assessors.
Another issue identified for the long-term recommendations is the sampling in laboratories. Sampling is quite a core part of the monitoring process. So if you're taking a sample, you want to make sure it's actually sampled correctly, that it hasn't been contaminated when they grab the sample. Currently there is no requirement or training for that. There is training, but it's not mandatory, it's not required. Those that have gone through the drinking water certificate and diploma have done the unit standards, but they may be the only ones that have done that. So there's a requirement actually that samplers are doing that, and the same goes with water supply, with laboratories as well. It's to do with INs. They have a different process, and there's a MOU being signed recently with the laboratories and Ministry of Health to try and pick that up for the sampling side of things. Also, when it comes to laboratories, there's a thing called a level 2 laboratory, which is an old hang-on pre-2000s. And they're these smaller regional laboratories that can do E. coli testing and so on, but the level 2 laboratories have no internal audit processes. And so there's a gap there, and so there's a recommendation that the level 2 laboratories are removed. And while they were talking to laboratories, they also raised the concern that there is no public health reference laboratory, and actually sharing of information and best practices and techniques between laboratories doesn't happen, and there's a need for that in New Zealand as well. So INs are quietly picking that one up. The NZS 4411 standard, you'll see that written in resource consents. You also see it in the drinking water standard. So that's the environmental standard for drilling soil and rock. It's actually quite a high, it's a 2001 document, it's quite a high level document. I have been talking to the New Zealand Drillers Federation, I know the person quite well. The general thought is a high level document, it's probably okay, but there's a need for a guidance document out there. There is no method of how do you maintain a bore, how do you test for integrity. There are a few methods for that, but they're very, they need developing and fleshing out, and actually some of those requirements may find themselves back into the drinking water standard for checking for bore integrity. At the moment, there is no competent bore driller allowing below ground head bores. They're not making them. So that was a finding from the inquiry as well, and there's a loophole in the NZS 4411 that allows for below ground level bores for drinking water supplies. The risk there is that if you have a stormwater event or a flooding event, is actually the wellhead's then submerged. So the idea is you have it above the 100-year floodplain. So as of last week, there's an agreement for the Water New Zealand, which is water services managers, and the Drillers Federation to work together and try to create a guidance document and look at reviewing that standard.
Thanks, Noel. So the last recommendation we want to talk about is the big, gnarly, scary, difficult one. And it's this idea of resolving the resourcing question for drinking water suppliers by having dedicated and aggregated drinking water supplies. So the inquiry's, I think, very clever in the way it manages and deals with this. And first up, it's kind of outside or close to the outside of the terms of reference. And they've said, well, we're not talking about the structure of local government, we're talking about the structure of water utilities. And so they very cleverly say the need for dedicated and aggregated drinking water supplies has been established. In other words, the case has been established for doing this. But rather than recommending that the government does it, they say the government should assess how best to achieve this. So it's slightly different. And because I think the inquiry recognises that this is a politically very difficult area. But why would they do it? Well, it provides you with critical mass. And critical mass is really important. Because if a water supply organisation has size, they're more likely to have capacity, and if they have capacity, they're more likely to have competence. And the converse is true. Small water suppliers often lack competence. They lack competence because they don't have capacity, and they don't have capacity because they lack size. And so the idea, or the model for this idea, is often spoken about as Scottish Water. So Scottish Water had a situation similar to New Zealand, where they had a large number of small water suppliers, and they said, this is not working, let's amalgamate them, and they amalgamated them into 3 water suppliers across the whole of the country, and after a while they said, actually, let's just have one. And so in Scottish Water, in Scotland, there's only 1 water supplier. And in New Zealand, there's 67, at least. So the idea is we adopt this model. You find it in Tasmania, there's a similar sort of thing in Malaysia, all across the world. And so, would you have, some people say, 6 water suppliers in New Zealand, or some people say 3, or South Island, Upper North Island, Lower North Island, some people say 1. So the inquiry doesn't look at that question. It just says government should look at this because the case has been established. And the reason is that if you have these bigger entities, achieving compliance is much easier because the resources are available to do that. And because the complexity of drinking water supplies has increased, and I talked about that, and I don't think anyone can doubt that. It's increased enormously. Even in the last 5 years, there's been considerable increase in technology. And if you were at the Water New Zealand conference and you saw some of the presentations about what's on the horizon, we can only know that it's going to become more complex. And of course, the cost of investment is a real hindrance for water supply. So, benefits are considered to be considerable, and the examples of Wellington Water and Watercare were used as examples where there's been considerable benefits within New Zealand of bigger water suppliers. And there's a couple of different models there. I'm not going to talk about those. What model you would use, again, that's all questions for debate. But the inquiry was very clear that the benefits from overseas have been seen. And one is a corporate structure, which is different from a local authority structure. And my understanding is that currently, under the Local Government Act, elected councillors cannot be prosecuted for failures by council. That's my understanding. The idea here is if you have a corporate structure, then the members of the board of that water supplier could be liable for prosecution for failures, for decisions that they make. In other words, if they make poor decisions, they will have to stand behind those decisions if they cause a problem. So corporate structure changes the whole game of water supply. You have better governance, better accountability, you have that critical mass I've talked about, and you can provide a common pricing strategy across a region. In other words, if you're collecting revenue from a big city, you can use that revenue to fund improvements in your small towns or small water supplies. And you can set a price across your whole region, one standard price. Whole bunch of things there. And the inquiry has heard and looked at this evidence and come to the conclusion that these would be benefits, and the benefits would be significant. And so they talk about improved financial outcomes, improved environmental outcomes, and improved outcomes for customers. And here's the thing. The inquiry makes this, I think, really important statement. And it's about public health versus cost. And it's a simple idea, a very simple idea. You can't say in a water supply that, well, it's in pretty poor condition and there's a chance of a whole lot of people getting sick, even someone dying, but it's very expensive, we won't do it. The inquiry says that's not a tenable position. It's very clear about that, this cost versus public health. And they say if a supplier can't afford it, then the model is flawed. The model for funding it is flawed, because bigger supplies provide an economy of scale. And so the inquiry says very clearly a compelling case has been established and the government should look at it. So what's the government going to do? Well, I'll tell you one thing, and that is there is going to be change in the drinking water industry in New Zealand, and it may take a matter of years to occur, but there is going to be change. So we talked about the problems in the industry. We talked about early and urgent new regulators. We talked about initially that risk landscape, early and urgent recommendations. We talked about the idea of a new regulator. We talked about secure bore water status being abandoned. We talked about the encouragement and the early recommendations of universal treatment, and a bunch of immediate actions that the Ministry of Health should take. And we also talked about joint working groups and encouragement for that. And in further recommendations, we talked about this idea of mandatory treatment and why that was recommended, and residual disinfectant in all water supplies. We talked about licensing and qualification systems. We talked about changes to the drinking water standards being recommended, changes to the Health Act or a new Drinking Water Act. We talked about laboratories and sampling, recommendations there. We talked about bore heads, and we talked about aggregated and dedicated drinking water supplies. And as I said before, and I'll say it again, if the government decides to do a quarter of the recommendations, just 1/4 of the recommendations, that will represent enormous change for our industry. And water suppliers need to understand what those changes will be, what the implications will be, and how that's going to affect them, because there will be effects.